Okay, so this is our first podcast and the camera died. Hey everyone, this is Rebecca from BrainBox AI's marketing team, and today we had the pleasure of having Chris Cianci join us. Chris is from our product team. He joined us to talk about a new feature that we have on our dashboard called Measure. So we're going to look at basically how this tool helps you calculate your Scope 1 and your Scope 2 emissions by automating some of those calculations and really streamlining that entire process. So I hope you'll enjoy it. I hope you'll learn something, and hopefully it'll contribute to your decarbonization journey. Hello, Chris.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here. So we're going to talk today about our Measure product, a brand new product. So just to start us off, can you tell us a bit about it? How did it come about? Why did BrainBox decide to make a Measure product?
Yeah, for sure. I think if you just look at the news these days, it's just, we realize that climate change is truly here, right? I mean, you step outside and you can kind of tell something's going wrong, right?
It's October 2nd and it's like 25 degrees outside.
It's unreal. We're almost in summer still. So we basically have seen this kind of holistic climate change activity happening, right? We've done a lot of research just in seeing even just from the industry perspective, there's been a lot of, commitments from organizations that we've started to see around climate change, which makes sense, right? At the same time, we were looking at data around, I think at the time it was about the top Fortune 500 companies. There was about 5% of these companies that in 2015 were actually committing to some sort of climate milestone.
In 2015?
In 2015, 5%.
A while ago, yeah.
In 2021, that number had risen to about 38% or 40%. Now,
okay.
I don't have the data for 2028,
double.
But you can only imagine in the last 2 years, the amount of industry talk about climate change. That number has most likely increased, I would say 60, 70%.
Yeah.
And so that's been a big change. And, why do we actually see this happening in terms of these commitments? Well, we experience what we see outdoors, but there's also a lot of legal and government pressures coming along as well. We see a lot of legislation. I bring up the context of the SEC. They've recently brought up context where they want
local law 97
local law,
in New York.
Exactly. And so there's all this kind of pressure that these organizations are under, which is I think a good thing. And we've also seen again from investors, right? Buildings now, people are considering dirty buildings as a lower class building. No one wants to invest in it because there's now these risks where with these laws you may be fined if you're emitting.
It's going from asset to liability.
Exactly. So there's just now in these different kind of areas where understanding your emissions profile from an organization perspective is super, super important, right? And we've seen a huge trend in ESG reporting that's starting to kind of increase as well. And some of the data that we looked at was in terms of what is the most challenging part of even building your ESG report was number one was calculating your scope emissions. Yes. And number two was even just having access to the data to calculate your scope emissions. So
just finding that information.
Figuring
out where it is, putting it together, making sure
it's
accurate.
It's new to a lot of people. Yeah. And so we pulled all this story has been kind of unfolding over the last year or so, and which led us to saying look, we have a lot of this data. We can pull in a lot of this information that we can help support our end user, our customers. And we think it would be value added because at the end of the day, you could be reducing emissions as an organization, but until you understand how much you are actually emitting, it's hard to gauge how much impact you're actually having, right? So you kind of need to start at the beginning, which is really measuring your emissions profile, right? And that's kind of the journey that we're trying to bring our clients on, right? Is understand, reduce, and then potentially offset to remove emissions from the atmosphere.
And I assume that challenge or the challenges you're raising are the same for small companies, medium-sized, large corporations? Are you seeing the same thing across
absolutely? And
all of them?
I think larger corporations, there's probably a lot more scrutiny right now because typically they're larger emitters, right?
Higher expectations, accountability.
Exactly. But this is across the board, and I think it's on us as just humans, right, to focus in on this because I even think of like our generation and the next generation is just going to be even worse. And if we don't tackle this now, we've already seen reports that like water temperatures have been increasing at record rates, and like it's just only going to increase.
Forest fires. The impacts this year have been really crazy.
Exactly.
Okay, so measure. So we have the challenges. Clearly, there's a need. We felt there was a need in the market across multiple sizes of businesses, small, medium, large. So what have we done? What has BrainBox brought to the table that we think is going to help
so
our building owners?
So we've basically built a tool that allows our clients to calculate their emissions. So we have an emissions reporting tool that you're able to take data and basically calculate how much emissions are being emitted based on a certain activity. So burning fuel, maybe you have trucks and cars as part of your fleet. We're going to be able to calculate your emissions data. So as long as we can take and consume the data, we will provide a report of your breakdown of scope 1 and scope 2, and providing the information. We can automate some of the data, but be able to, again, quantify what your emissions profile is so that you can then take action on, I need to reduce X amount to be either carbon neutral and net zero. And it feeds data into your ESG strategy at the end of the day.
It gives you information, knowledge, awareness.
You can't act without having the information, right?
Yeah.
You could, but you're just going down a blind route. Right?
Okay, so let's get into that.
Yeah.
I guess before starting into the details, is this tool for like people that are really into the sustainability track, the directors of sustainability, VPs? What kind of background or information do you need to have?
Great question. So I would say with ESG and sustainability, like it's a new world for a lot of people. Obviously, if you're directly focused on sustainability, you're going to have a lot of knowledge around scope reporting and the context and the groupings of all these different terms or terminology. But the way that we have built our tool is we're trying to be as transparent as possible. We're trying to make it easy for people to start their journey, right? And that's a really key focus here, is that it is a journey. No one's going to get this right at the first shot at this. Like there's so much.
Start somewhere, yeah.
You can be super advanced where you're doing everything, or you can just start small. And the real piece here I want to harp on is that start small. Start focusing on maybe your scope 2 electricity, which is typically pretty simple. The data is accessible.
Okay.
Start there, and then as you get advanced as an organization, maybe you're going to do all your scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, right? But you start small, and the way that we built this is that the idea here is you can start in small buckets that you can start your journey, or if you're more advanced, you can use the full functionality of the feature, essentially.
I think that's really smart because, as I mentioned before, like the smaller companies also need this, right? And sometimes you don't have a sustainability guru in-house, or you have your, somebody from finance or somebody from marketing running the sustainability initiative. So this kind of allows them to be able to calculate and figure it out themselves.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so that's a really good point, is that typically what we've seen with these smaller type organizations, like they may not have a sustainability team, right? So it's going to be...
They're trying to figure it out
the
themselves.
CEO managing this stuff, right? And the whole purpose around this was to provide an easy, accessible tool that anyone can kind of use and find knowledge around what does this world even mean? Because it is a whole other world for a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
And
So maybe as the marketing person at BrainBox, I'll take this opportunity to just mention, we also have, as part of this solution, we have a lot of information-based tools as well, guides or documents or knowledge sharing. I think there's a whole knowledge sharing portion to this to this application or to this app. And I think that's really useful too for people who are on their journey, kind of just learning, figuring things out. They need a base of knowledge before they can even use the tool. You have all of that.
Exactly. So as part of the tool, we do have kind of an FAQ documentation page, and it really outlines, what specifically this tool does, which is, again, a full scope 1 and scope 2 calculator. It provides you information on what data do you actually need, because all this consumes data. It needs data to be able to... Exactly.
What's good, what's not. Yeah.
Exactly. And then there's other components to this where, the engine that we've built pulls emissions factors from various sources. So the way we've built it, again, is with very much transparency in mind. We can get into this a bit later, but the idea here is we're sharing all this information upfront for our users. We have access to guides about understanding greenhouse gases, what are the 3 gases, like all of that information, so that someone with zero knowledge could come in, read this information, read this documentation, and really get a full grasp of what does this world actually even mean? How do I use it? What do I need? And start planning their strategy on actually leveraging the tool and actually not promoting, but sharing this information with
getting the benefits from it.
Exactly.
And the next, measurement is the first step, right? You can't, some people have done reduction before measurement, but it's really difficult to.
You can't quantify your impact.
Where you're going, how much impact it's having, if it's something that's worth doing again or more in the long term. So, good place to start. So we have the basis, we get the knowledge, helps us figure out, the bedrock. And then we have, I guess we go into scope 1 first, scope 2 first.
Yeah.
Scope
So,
1.
I like to, if for those listening, that to understand what scope 1 versus scope 2 is, the way I kind of explain this is they're just categories of different types of activities, right? And so scope 1 is really broken down to 3 kind of subcategories. There's stationary combustion, which is, think of you're in a building and you burn natural gas to heat your building. Well, when you're burning that fuel, you're releasing emissions to the atmosphere. So quantifying that activity releases emissions.
So that fits into scope 1.
That's the scope 1 stationary. There's scope 1 mobile combustion, which is, let's say, as an organization, maybe you have, and I use the example of an ice cream company, right? You have an ice cream truck on the road. It's burning fuel, which is releasing emissions. It's going 10 miles a day. Quantifying what your fleet of vehicles, your mobile fleet is emitting. You're able to do that as well within the tool. And then there's fugitive combustion. So let's say you have HVAC equipment on the roof of your building, and that takes refrigerant, and that refrigerant leaks, and that quantity of refrigerant that is emitted to the atmosphere is extremely harmful. And we're able to,
I hear it's the worst. It's the worst one.
Horrible,
right?
horrible.
Yeah, it's
a very big impact. And so, based on how we've built this with our formulas, based on various protocols, we can quantify what that actual emissions profile has been released to the atmosphere. So then you get a good idea of what's going on, and you want to probably focus on equipment that really has a lot of leaks, so you're lessening your emissions.
And when you say calculate, so how does that work? Is it all pre-programmed in the background?
Yeah. So we've basically built an engine that will, depending on if you're doing scope 1 stationary or mobile, there's different calculations behind that. But what we really need is just the data, right? And so depending on the data, so I'll talk maybe around scope 1. So scope 1 is, let's say you have utility data for propane or natural gas. We have the ability to actually automate that information. So if we can pull in your bills around propane or natural gas use, we can actually pull it in, and our engine has the proper calculations to take the proper emissions factor for that natural gas or propane for your location and calculate it automatically for you.
Run the calculation. And then what does it look like when the calculation is run? You see it every day, every week, every month?
Yeah, so it's up to the user really how often they want to come in here. Yeah, exactly. So if we have the data automation set up for the specific pieces, whenever we get the data in terms of a bill, if it's every month, they can come in every month and they'll see the information. It'll be calculated. They'll be able to see the totals, see the report of information. They could come in once a year if they wanted to, right? As long as they have the automation set up. There's nothing really they have to do. It just keeps
doing it in the background?
Keeps automatically doing it, exactly. And so if you want to just come in here at the end of the year and pull the data for your ESG report, you can do that. If you're a lot more, again, maybe advanced and want to see on a month-to-month basis and calculate trends, you can come in here on a day-to-day basis if you want to, right?
Yeah. And I got a sneak peek of what it looks like before this. Looks great. It seems very flexible and intuitive. So I think that's great for somebody who... It's good for people who want to see the big picture, and then it's good for people who want to dig into it, nitty gritty, figure out the details. And I guess it's the same thing for the 2 other buckets of scope 1.
Yeah, so for scope one, we can automate it if it's coming in through utility data.
Okay.
Mobile combustion and fugitive is a lot more difficult, it's a lot more manual, but we do have the ability to bulk upload information. So
Okay.
if you have, let's say, fuel receipts information for your mobile fleet, we can pull that in, bulk upload it, and it'll, again, as long as you bulk upload the data, so you burned, 20 liters of fuel,
Yeah.
the calculation will be automatic for you and calculate all that information.
Yeah, so there's a manual portion of like finding the information and putting it in, but then there's an automation in terms of calculating it all, figuring it all out for you, giving you the totals.
Yep.
I mean, that's a lot of time saved.
Yeah.
Just for that part.
Depending on, like, let's say you were an organization that maybe has one or two buildings. Sure, you can go and do this work yourself, right? And maybe have someone go and find the emissions factor and all that.
I'm sure a lot of people are doing that right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, manually.
Right?
Really manually.
But now start thinking when you're an organization of 10, 50, 100, 1,000, 2,000 buildings.
Yes.
And you're not in the same province or state or country, you have different emissions factors for different countries, and so
different energy.
It just becomes unsustainable to do this manually. And if you are, you're most likely bringing it to another organization or firm to do that work for you, right? And there's dollars out the door. What we've built is that the engine that we've built, it basically will source the data and emissions factors based on your building's location, province, state, country, depending on what's available. And that will be automated for you. So you don't have to have someone going and trying to find the latest emissions factor for the US or UK or Australia. Make a mistake.
Those change every year, I think.
They're every country is essentially, or government organization is deploying this information at different times of the year. Yeah. Different months, different days, and how do you keep up with that? It becomes a nightmare when you start having hundreds of buildings, thousands of buildings. And so, what's incredible about this tool is that it will handle all that for you, right? As long as we have, let's say, some sort of utility sync information with specifically like scope 2, which is purchase electricity, all that will be automated, and it'll all come in. And
it's less about outsourcing, more about empowering within, right? That's how I would maybe summarize that. GHG protocol?
Yeah, so all of our, basically we built all this based with GHG protocol guidance in mind. GHG protocol is the...
I was going to ask, could you give a one-liner for maybe those that don't know?
It essentially provides the guidance on how we should be providing and categorizing this data. What data should we be using to actually report on this information? And
sort of the standards framework.
It's the standards framework, exactly, of how everyone does this. So this is kind of the top layer. We leverage some guidance from the EPA for certain pieces where, again, all this funnels back to the standards.
EPA standing for?
So the Environmental Protection Agency for the U.S.
Exactly. Oh, there you go.
And to me, they are
test of acronym for you, Chris.
I'm not in the U.S. Not in the U.S. But they to me are, I want to say, based on what I've seen, like they are the most advanced, just from an emissions standards guidance that they provide from a country perspective. So it's we do leverage some content around them for stationary stuff, but essentially it's all following the GHG protocol standards and framework, and scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, all that. It comes from the GHG protocol essentially.
And another element I was reflecting on, I think what's really good about a flexible tool like that too is as your business changes and mutates, you can use it and adapt it, right? So BrainBox, for example, we just acquired another business, right? That adds another complexity of emissions calculation. Well, this sort of automation, it allows you to bring in these new units of business much more easily, and kind of streamlines and gives the power again in-house.
But I want to add to that is that, like, what I really want to harp on here is that, like, again, it's all about the journey where you don't have to use every single part of this tool in terms of your emission, right? Like, you can start on where I think is probably the simplest for organizations is scope 2, purchase electricity, your utility bills. Start somewhere, and you're having an impact just by starting, and then. As the months go by and quarters go by, you start to, I'm going to focus on the scope 2. I'm going to now focus on scope 1. And you start to build up your whole emissions strategy, right? And how you do that. And that's what I think is most important, because if you don't start, well,
you need to take that first step.
Yeah.
And it can be scary, but there's low-hanging fruit.
Exactly.
So I guess scope 2, similar to scope 1, I assume.
Yeah.
A lot more automated, I guess.
Yeah. So typically, we look at scope 2 as like purchase electricity. So I always try to think of your utility bills. Even a home or the business is going to be using most likely electricity. That is easily accessible data, and where I would suggest people to start is your utility bills, right? So you know how much kilowatt hours that you've spent or used over the last months. We can easily automate that information with our utility sync, bring it in, and again, based on your building's location, we will automatically source the most relevant emissions factor for you.
Tell me about the utility sync. Like, this is, I think, the most powerful part.
Yeah. So it's really
we don't need to look for bills anymore.
No,
right?
no, exactly. So, and we've heard this very much from a lot of our customers. Just, I don't have access to my bills, right? So we do work with a third-party service that allows us to connect to a user's utility account, and we will basically pull through an API their utility bills, and so we will use that data to then calculate that information for them. So it's pretty streamlined, straightforward. So it's really just set up, and there's nothing really else you have to do. It's pretty good.
And I assume the tool then puts the scope 1 and 2 together. And is there any sort of like downloadable documentation?
Yeah,
like how do you share the info?
Absolutely. So we do have a summary page, which again breaks down different, like, I don't want to call them KPIs, but different metrics around your actual emissions profile for your organization. So you'll have basically a summary of your tons of CO2 equivalent that you've emitted. You'll have information around like the breakdown of actual GHGs. So we will tell you it is broken down by X percentage of CO2 versus methane, et cetera. If you have, again, past yearly data, or data from, let's say, 2020, 2021, 2022, we can pull that information in, and we'll be able to show you trends, right, over the years. How has your emissions profile actually been, either increasing, decreasing? How has your different initiatives have been impacting your emissions? We're able to show just data like that. And then also an actual report that you'll be able to generate with a PDF. So you can share that with...
you can actually download it.
Exactly. So you can share that within your organization and use that data to supplement your ESG reporting and in the future.
Awesome. I think, did I forget any features, or that's that? I think that covers.
Maybe one more piece. Maybe we can discuss is even just like the auditability of the information.
Yeah.
And so, with our tool, again, as I mentioned, like, we are pulling emission sources from different areas, right? Depending on your building's location, but all this data is available for the user to export and see. And so, we share what emissions factor we used, what source it came from, what government documentation we got it from, what year it was used. So all that is available. And see, we're not just making up numbers, right? These are real, exactly. But these are all real pieces of data based on a certain time frame, and all that is accessible for the users. If there is a third-party audit or an organization's emissions claims, all that is there, and all the calculations can be backward calculated. It's all available for them.
Awesome. I think that's about it. But thank you for giving us the run through.
You're welcome.
And I think there's loads more information about the tool on the website.
Yep.
So if anybody wants to check those out. But thanks again.
Well, thank you.